The CEO's perfect blind date plan backfires. His disappeared ex-fiancée shows up instead. Reed Hastings checked his platinum watch as he strode through the revolving doors of Meridian Cafe, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble with the confidence of a man who owned half the city's skyline. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden shadows across cream-colored walls adorned with local artwork. He inhaled deeply, savoring the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and the sweet undertone of vanilla pastries that made this place his brother Ryan's favorite spot. A satisfied smile played at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed the elegant space. Everything was perfect for Ryan's blind date with the woman their mutual friend had described as absolutely perfect for him. Reed had personally vetted this arrangement, ensuring his younger brother would finally meet someone worthy of the Hastings name, someone sophisticated, accomplished, and most importantly, someone who wouldn't break his heart the way Reed's had been shattered 5 years ago. The gentle murmur of afternoon conversations mixed with the soft jazz playing overhead, creating an atmosphere of refined romance. Crystal chandeliers caught the sunlight, scattering rainbow prisms across white linen tablecloths, where couples leaned in close, lost in intimate conversations. This was exactly the kind of place where lasting connections began, where two souls could discover they were meant to find each other. Reed's chest swelled with brotherly pride as he spotted a woman seated alone at the corner table he'd specifically requested, the one with the best view of the city's historic district, where autumn leaves painted the trees in shades of amber and gold. She sat with her back to him, but everything about her posture spoke of elegance and grace. Her dark hair was swept into a sophisticated chignon, and she wore a navy dress that hugged her shoulders in a way that suggested both confidence and femininity. This had to be her, the woman who would finally give Ryan the happiness he deserved. Reed's protective instincts had driven him to arrive early, wanting to ensure everything was arranged perfectly for his brother's arrival in 20 minutes. He'd even spoken with Maria, the cafe owner, about the special champagne he'd ordered to celebrate what he hoped would be the beginning of Ryan's happily ever after. Reed lifted his ceramic coffee cup halfway to his lips, already tasting the victory of a perfectly orchestrated evening. The woman at the corner table began to turn, perhaps sensing someone's presence, and Reed found himself holding his breath with anticipation. In just moments, he'd introduce himself as Ryan's brother, maybe share a few encouraging words about what a wonderful man Ryan was, and then discreetly retreat to let love work its magic. But as she turned fully around, the world tilted off its axis. Time didn't just slow. It stopped completely, suspended in a moment so shocking that Reed's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, the dark liquid trembling against the white porcelain. His lungs forgot how to function, and his heart hammered against his ribs with such force he was certain everyone in the cafe could hear it. The woman staring back at him with equally stunned dark eyes wasn't just any woman. She was the woman who had haunted his dreams for 5 years, the one whose ghost had turned him from a romantic young man into the steel-hearted CEO he'd become. She was the reason he'd never been able to love anyone else, the reason he worked 18-hour days to avoid going home to an empty penthouse that still smelled faintly of her perfume in his most vulnerable moments. Simone Montclair. Her designer purse slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the marble floor with a soft thud that echoed through his consciousness like thunder. Those same expressive eyes that had once gazed at him with infinite love now reflected the same shock and recognition that was surely written across his own face. Her full lips, lips he'd kissed countless times, lips that had whispered promises of forever, parted in a sharp intake of breath that he felt echo in his own chest. She was supposed to be gone, disappeared, living some impossibly glamorous life in Europe where she'd fled 5 years ago, leaving nothing behind but a brief note and the engagement ring he still kept locked in his office safe. She wasn't supposed to be here, in his city, looking even more beautiful than his memories had preserved, wearing that particular shade of navy blue that had always been his favorite on her. The navy dress that clung to curves he remembered mapping with reverent hands. The way she held her head with that unconsciously regal bearing that had always made his breath catch. The small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident she'd told him about during one of their late-night conversations, when the future had seemed as bright and infinite as the stars they'd counted from his apartment balcony. Reed's hand began to shake, and he set the coffee cup down with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against the saucer with finality. Around them, the cafe continued its afternoon rhythm, conversations flowing like gentle water, the espresso machine hissing, silverware chiming against plates, but all of it felt muffled and distant, as if they existed in a bubble where only their shared shock mattered. How long did they stare at each other across that sun-drenched space? Seconds? Minutes? Hours? Reed couldn't tell. All he knew was that every carefully constructed wall he'd built around his heart was crumbling like ancient stone, leaving him as vulnerable and desperate as the day she'd vanished from his life without explanation. Simone was the first to move, rising from her chair with the fluid grace he remembered so well, though her movements seemed as unsteady as his, felt. The afternoon light caught the subtle highlights in her hair, and he noticed she was wearing the small pearl earrings she'd always favored, a detail so intimately familiar it made his chest ache with the weight of everything they'd lost. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not when he'd finally reached a place where he could function without the constant ache of missing her. Not when he'd convinced himself that what they'd shared had been nothing more than youthful infatuation, easily replaced by the right woman when he was ready to try again. But one look at her proved every lie he'd told himself over the past 5 years. The instant, electric recognition that passed between them, the way his body responded to her presence as if no time had passed at all, the familiar catch in his breathing when their eyes met, it all confirmed what he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. He'd never stopped loving Simone Montclair, not for a single day, not for a single hour. And judging by the way her hand had flown to her throat in that unconscious gesture he remembered so well, the way her dark eyes had filled with unshed tears before she quickly blinked them away, she hadn't forgotten him either. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. The question that would haunt Reed for the rest of his life began forming in his mind as they stood frozen in that moment of recognition. How do you face the one person who holds every piece of your shattered heart, especially when you thought you'd never see them again? But fate, it seemed, had other plans. And sometimes the universe conspires to give us exactly what we need, precisely when we think we're strong enough to live without it. Reed Hastings had built an empire on calculated risks and strategic planning, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment when his past and present collided in the most impossible, beautiful, terrifying way imaginable. The woman he'd loved beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond the bounds of everything his family had expected of him, was sitting at the table meant for his brother's blind date. And for the first time in 5 years, Reed Hastings had absolutely no idea what happened next. 5 years earlier, Reed Hastings had been a different man entirely. At 28, he'd possessed all the confidence and romantic idealism of someone who'd never experienced real heartbreak, someone who believed that love could conquer any obstacle with enough determination and sincerity. He'd been the heir apparent to Hastings Enterprises, yes, but he'd also been a man who stopped to buy flowers from street vendors just because they reminded him of his girlfriend's smile. The night he'd met Simone had been one of those perfect autumn evenings that felt touched by magic. The Meridian Gallery was hosting its annual Emerging Artists Showcase, and Reed had attended reluctantly, his mind half-focused on a merger proposal he'd been reviewing. He'd been nursing a glass of champagne and studying a particularly striking abstract piece when he'd heard laughter. Warm, genuine, unguarded laughter that cut through the pretentious murmur of gallery patrons like music. He'd turned toward the sound and seen her for the first time. A woman in a simple black dress that somehow outshone every designer gown in the room, gesturing animatedly as she explained the emotional technique behind a vibrant painting to a small group of captivated listeners. Her passion was magnetic, infectious, drawing people into her orbit like moths to flame. But it was the way she tilted her head when she listened, the way her eyes lit up when someone asked an insightful question that had made Reed forget everything else in the room. When their eyes had finally met across that crowded gallery, the connection had been instant and undeniable. Not the polite attraction he was used to from the society women his mother constantly introduced him to, but something raw and electric that had made his skin tingle and his breath catch. She'd smiled, not the calculated smile he was accustomed to, but something genuine and slightly surprised, as if she'd felt the same unexpected jolt of recognition. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of stolen afternoons and late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. Simone had shown him parts of the city he'd never noticed, despite living there his entire life. Hidden coffee shops, where struggling artists gathered to debate technique, bookstores with secret reading nooks, rooftop gardens where the city noise faded into whispers. She'd taught him to see beauty in unexpected places, to find poetry in the mundane rhythm of everyday life. Reed had fallen completely, desperately, irrevocably in love with everything about her. The way she hummed unconsciously when she was concentrating, how she insisted on trying to cook elaborate meals despite having absolutely no talent for it, the soft sound she made when she slept, curled against his chest. He'd loved her fierce independence, her unwavering support for her friends, the way she could make him laugh even after his most stressful days at the office. Within 6 months, he'd known with absolute certainty that she was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. The engagement ring, a vintage Art Deco design he'd found at an estate sale because she'd once mentioned loving the geometric elegance of that era, had burned a hole in his pocket for weeks before he'd finally found the perfect moment to propose. It had been in the family garden behind the Hastings estate, during the spring when the cherry blossoms were at their peak. He'd led her there after Sunday dinner with his parents, claiming he wanted to show her how the new landscaping had turned out. But really, he'd wanted to propose in the place where he'd dreamed of their future children playing, where he'd imagined growing old with her among the flowers she'd helped him plant. When he'd dropped to one knee on the stone path between the rose bushes, Simone had started crying before he'd even opened the ring box. Her yes had been whispered through tears of joy, and when he'd slipped the ring onto her finger, it had fit as perfectly as she'd fit into his life. They'd made love that afternoon among the flowers, with sunlight filtering through the apple blossoms and the distant sound of his mother's voice calling them in for tea. The wedding planning had been a blur of happy chaos. Simone had wanted something intimate and meaningful rather than the society spectacle his mother preferred, and Reed had supported every decision she'd made. They'd chosen the same garden for their ceremony, selected a string quartet instead of a full orchestra, decided on wildflowers instead of imported roses. Everything had been perfect, a reflection of their love story rather than family expectations. And then, 3 weeks before their wedding date, she'd simply vanished. Reed had woken up in his apartment to find her side of the bed cold and empty, her clothes gone from the closet, her easel and art supplies missing from the corner where they'd created a makeshift studio. On his pillow, she'd left a single sheet of cream-colored paper with words that had destroyed him. "I'm sorry. You deserve better than I can give you. Please don't look for me. I love you enough to let you go." And on the nightstand, the engagement ring he'd chosen so carefully, sitting in its box like an accusation. The months that followed had been the darkest of Reed's life. He'd hired private investigators, called every friend they'd had in common, even contacted art schools and galleries across the country. It was as if Simone Montclair had simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing behind but the ache in his chest and the questions that tortured him every sleepless night. His family had been sympathetic at first, then relieved, then increasingly frustrated with his inability to move on and find a more suitable match. His mother had thrown eligible daughters of family friends at him with increasing desperation, and his father had suggested that perhaps Simone's disappearance had been a blessing in disguise. The woman hadn't been from their social circle after all. She'd had no family connections, no trust fund, no understanding of the responsibilities that came with the Hastings name. Reed had eventually stopped arguing with them, stopped defending Simone's memory, stopped explaining that no one could replace her. Instead, he'd channeled all his pain and passion into work, transforming from the romantic young man who'd bought flowers and written love letters into the calculating CEO who closed deals with ruthless efficiency and never mixed business with pleasure. By his own estimation, he'd become exactly the kind of man his father had always wanted him to be. Successful, focused, unencumbered by messy emotions or romantic entanglements. The kind of man who arranged blind dates for his brother, but never went on them himself. The kind of man who'd convinced himself that love was a luxury he could live without. But now, staring across a sun-drenched cafe at the woman who'd taken his heart with her when she'd disappeared, Reed realized just how completely he'd been lying to himself. Every wall he'd built, every defense he'd constructed, every carefully maintained emotional distance, it all crumbled to dust in the space of a heartbeat. Because Simone Montclair was sitting not 20 feet away from him, looking as shocked and breathless as he felt, and all those years of telling himself he was over her proved to be nothing more than an elaborate self-deception. She was supposed to be Ryan's blind date. The realization hit Reed like a physical blow, doubling the surreal impossibility of the moment. Somehow, through some cosmic joke or divine intervention, the woman he'd never stopped loving had been matched with his brother by their well-meaning mutual friend who had no idea about Reed and Simone's history. What would you do if you came face to face with the love who broke your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This community understands the complexity of second chances. The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, filled with 5 years of unspoken words, unanswered questions, and the kind of electric tension that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Other patrons continued their conversations around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the corner table, where two people's carefully reconstructed lives had just collided with devastating force. Reed forced himself to breathe, to think, to remember that he was no longer the heartbroken young man who'd spent months searching for her. He was Reed Hastings, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, a man who solved impossible problems for a living. Surely he could handle one unexpected encounter with his ex-fiancée, no matter how much his hands were trembling or how difficult it was to form coherent thoughts. But as Simone slowly stood from her chair, her dark eyes never leaving his face, Reed realized that some problems couldn't be solved with logic and strategy. Some moments required you to feel everything you'd spent years trying to forget, and hope you were strong enough to survive the flood of emotions that threatened to drown you. The woman he'd loved beyond reason was here, real, breathing the same air he was breathing. And God help him, despite everything she'd put him through, his first instinct wasn't anger or hurt or even confusion. His first instinct was joy. Chapter 2. Simone's legs felt unsteady as she rose from the chair, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table for support. The simple act of standing seemed monumental when her entire world had just shifted off its foundation. She'd agreed to this blind date as a favor to Jasmine, her best friend, who'd insisted that 5 years was long enough to hide from love. You can't spend your entire life in European galleries avoiding emotional connections, Jasmine had argued during their last video call. It's time to take a chance on happiness again. If only Jasmine had known that the last time Simone had taken a chance on happiness, it had led to the most devastating decision of her life. Reed looked exactly as she'd remembered him in her dreams, yet somehow more substantial, more commanding than even her most vivid memories had preserved. The boy she'd fallen in love with had grown into a man who wore power like a second skin, his broad shoulders filling out his charcoal suit with the kind of confidence that could silence a boardroom with a single glance. His dark hair was shorter now, more conservative, but it still held that slight wave that had always made her want to run her fingers through it. But it was his eyes that undid her, those same green eyes that had once looked at her like she was his entire universe, now studying her with a mixture of shock, pain, and something else she didn't dare name. The crow's feet at the corners spoke of stress and sleepless nights, and she wondered with a pang of guilt how much of that wear was her fault. Simone. Her name on his lips was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 5 years of silence between them. The way he said it, like a prayer, like an accusation, like a question that had no answer, made her chest tighten with emotions she'd spent years learning to suppress. Reed. She managed his name through a throat that felt lined with sandpaper. I had no idea. That you were Ryan's blind date? Reed's voice carried that familiar note of dry humor she'd once found irresistible, though now it was edged with something sharper. Neither did I. Our mutual friend apparently has quite the sense of irony. The mention of Ryan sent a fresh wave of mortification through Simone's system. Sweet, uncomplicated Ryan, who'd been nothing but a name mentioned in passing during her relationship with Reed. The younger Hastings brother, who was supposed to meet her here for coffee and conversation, blissfully unaware that his date had once been engaged to his older brother. I should leave. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, her instinct for self-preservation warring with the part of her that had missed him so desperately it had become a physical ache. This is impossible. I can't. Wait. Reed's hand shot out as if to stop her, though he didn't actually touch her. The space between them crackled with electricity, and Simone found herself frozen by the intensity in his gaze. Please, don't run away. Again? The quiet desperation in his voice was her undoing. This was Reed, the man who'd held her through thunderstorms because she was afraid of lightning, who'd learned to make her grandmother's soup recipe when she'd been homesick, who'd proposed to her in a garden full of flowers and promised to love her for the rest of their lives, the man whose heart she'd broken because she'd been too scared and insecure to believe she deserved his love. I'm not running, she said softly, though they both knew it was a lie. Running was exactly what she'd done 5 years ago, and running was what every instinct in her body was screaming at her to do now. Reed, what are we supposed to do with this? How do we even begin to? I don't know. His honesty was brutal and beautiful, and it reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Reed had never been one for easy answers or comfortable lies. But we're here now, both of us, and I think we owe it to ourselves to figure out what that means. As if summoned by the tension in the air, Maria appeared at their table with the warm smile that had made Meridian Cafe a neighborhood institution for over 20 years. The elderly woman's dark eyes moved between Reed and Simone with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from decades of witnessing human drama unfold over coffee and pastries. Mr. Hastings, Maria said gently, your usual table is ready if you'd prefer somewhere more private for this conversation. Reed's grateful smile was answer enough. Without discussion, they found themselves following Maria to a secluded corner booth tucked behind a decorative screen painted with climbing roses. The space was intimate without being claustrophobic, far enough from other patrons that they could speak without being overheard. I'll bring you both some coffee, Maria murmured as they settled across from each other on cushioned benches that forced them to sit closer than either of them was prepared for. Take all the time you need. The silence that followed Maria's departure was thick with everything they weren't saying. Simone found herself studying Reed's hands where they rested on the white tablecloth, those strong, capable hands she'd once known as intimately as her own. He still wore his college ring on his right hand, she noticed, but his left hand was conspicuously bare. No wedding band, no sign that he'd moved on and found someone else to love. The relief that flooded through her at that observation was immediately followed by shame. She had no right to feel possessive about Reed's romantic life, not after what she'd done to him, not after the way she'd disappeared like a coward instead of trusting him enough to tell him the truth about why she couldn't marry him. You look good, Reed said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. Different, but good. More confident, maybe? Simone glanced down at herself, suddenly self-conscious about the navy dress she'd chosen specifically for this date. She'd wanted to look polished but approachable for Ryan, professional but not intimidating. Now she wondered what Reed saw when he looked at her. Did he see the girl who'd left him, or the woman she'd worked so hard to become. 5 years will do that to a person, she replied, aiming for lightness and failing miserably. I've been busy, working, traveling, living. In Europe, it wasn't a question. Somehow he'd known where she'd gone, even though she'd tried so hard to disappear completely. Paris, mostly. Then Milan, London, Barcelona. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup Maria had silently placed in front of her, grateful for something to focus on besides the way Reed was looking at her. I've been working as an art consultant, helping galleries acquire pieces, advising collectors. It's been fulfilling. But lonely, Reed observed, with that uncanny ability he'd always had to read her emotions, even when she was trying to hide them. The accuracy of his statement hit her like a physical blow. Yes, it had been lonely. Desperately, achingly lonely. She'd built a successful career, traveled to incredible places, met fascinating people. And through it all, she'd felt like she was living someone else's life. Every sunset over the Seine, every masterpiece she'd discovered in a dusty attic, every triumph and joy, she'd experienced it all with reed-shaped hole in her chest. "And you?" she asked, deflecting his observation with a question of her own. "CEO now, just like your father always planned." Reed's smile was sharp enough to cut. "Exactly like he planned. I've been very dutiful, very focused, very successful at everything that doesn't matter." The bitterness in his voice made her flinch. This wasn't the man she'd left behind, the one who'd balanced ambition with compassion, who'd talked about using his family's resources to make a difference in the world. This Reed seemed harder, more cynical, as if something essential had been carved out of him and never replaced. Something like hope, something like joy, something like the ability to trust that love was worth the risk. "Reed," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to acknowledge the pain she saw in his eyes. "Why?" The single word cut through her attempt at comfort like a blade. "That's all I want to know, Simone. After all this time, all I've ever wanted to know is why you left, why you threw away everything we'd built together, why you couldn't trust me enough to talk to me about whatever was wrong." The anguish in his voice nearly broke her resolve to keep the truth buried. She'd practiced this conversation 1,000 times in her head over the years, but she'd never imagined having it here, in the place where they'd shared so many happy memories, with the late afternoon sun streaming through windows and creating the same golden atmosphere that had surrounded so many of their dates. "It wasn't about trust," she whispered, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "It was never about not trusting you." "Then what?" "What could have been so terrible that you couldn't even give me a chance to fight for us?" The pain in his eyes was unbearable, and Simone felt the careful control she'd maintained for 5 years beginning to crack. How could she tell him the truth? How could she explain that she'd left because she'd loved him too much to watch his family destroy him? That she'd overheard his mother's conversation with her bridge club, the cruel words about that girl who was so clearly wrong for their family, and how she would never fit into their world. How could she admit that Marge Hastings' casual cruelty had confirmed every insecurity Simone had ever harbored about their relationship? That she'd realized she would always be the girl from the wrong side of town, the one without the right connections or background, the one who would hold Reed back from the life his family expected him to live. "Your mother," she began, then stopped, the words catching in her throat like thorns. Reed's entire body went still. "What about my mother?" "I heard her talking to Mrs. Wellington and Mrs. Ashford at the club, 3 days before our wedding." The words came out in a rush, like poison being drawn from a wound. "She said I would never fit into your world, that I was holding you back from your true potential. She said you were infatuated with the idea of rebelling against your family, but that eventually you'd realize you needed someone who could be a proper wife to someone in your position." Reed's face went white, then flushed with anger so intense that Simone instinctively leaned back. "And you believed her?" "I didn't want to," Simone whispered. "But Reed, look around. Look at what you've accomplished since I left. Look at the man you've become. Maybe she was right. Maybe I would have held you back." That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Reed's voice was low and dangerous, the kind of controlled fury that made board members quake in their expensive shoes. You think I wanted this life? You think I chose to become some emotionless corporate automaton? You think any of this success means anything without you to share it with? The raw pain in his voice made tears spring to Simone's eyes. Reed, don't what? Don't tell you the truth? Don't admit that I've spent 5 years trying to convince myself that I was better off without you while every day felt like I was slowly dying inside? Outside, thunder rumbled ominously, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the cafe windows. The sudden change in weather seemed to mirror the emotional storm building between them, and Simone found herself glancing toward the door with the same instinct for flight that had ruled her life for the past 5 years. But Reed noticed her movement, and his hand shot across the table to cover hers before she could pull away. The contact was electric, sending shock waves up her arm and straight to her heart. His skin was warm and familiar, and for a moment she could almost pretend that no time had passed, that they were still the couple who'd been planning their future together in this very cafe. "Please," Reed said quietly, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture so achingly familiar it made her chest tight. "Don't run away from me again. Not when we're finally talking. Not when I'm finally getting answers to the questions that have been destroying me for 5 years." The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Other cafe patrons were pulling out umbrellas and debating whether to wait out the storm, but Simone barely noticed them. All her attention was focused on the man across from her, the one whose touch was unraveling every carefully constructed defense she'd built around her heart. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I thought I was saving you from having to choose between me and your family. I thought if I left, you could have the life you were supposed to have without the complications I brought with me. The life I was supposed to have." Reed's laugh was bitter and broken. "Simone, you were my life. You were the only thing that made any of the rest of it matter. Do you have any idea what it did to me when you left? Do you know what it's been like trying to function with half my soul missing?" The intensity of his words, the raw honesty in his voice, broke something open inside Simone's chest. This was why she'd run. Not because she didn't love him, but because she'd loved him too much to bear the thought of watching that love turn to resentment when her presence complicated his carefully planned future. But looking at him now, seeing the pain she'd caused written across his beloved features, she began to wonder if her noble sacrifice had been nothing more than cowardice dressed up as selflessness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears finally spilling over despite her attempts to maintain control. "Reed, I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought—" "You thought my mother's opinion mattered more than what we had together." Reed's voice was gentle now, but the words still stung like a slap. "You thought so little of my love for you that you believed I'd choose family approval over my own happiness. That's not—" she began, then stopped, because wasn't that exactly what she'd thought? Hadn't she convinced herself that Reed would eventually realize his family was right, that he deserved someone better suited to his world? The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the afternoon prematurely dark and creating a cocoon of intimacy around their secluded table. Reed still hadn't let go of her hand, and despite everything, despite the years of separation and the pain they'd caused each other, Simone couldn't bring herself to pull away. "I was scared," she admitted finally, the words barely above a whisper. "I was 25 years old and terrified that I wasn't good enough for you. When I heard your mother talking about how I'd never belong in your world, it confirmed every insecurity I'd ever had about our relationship. I panicked. And instead of talking to me about it, instead of trusting me to handle my own family, you decided to make the choice for both of us." The quiet devastation in his voice was almost unbearable. Simone had replayed this conversation countless times over the years, but she'd never imagined how much worse the reality would be than her worst nightmares. Seeing the pain in Reed's eyes, Understanding how completely her actions had broken him was a special kind of torture. "I know I handled it wrong," she said through her tears. "I know I should have talked to you. But Reed, I was so afraid that you'd choose me out of obligation, or that you'd resent me later for coming between you and your family. I couldn't bear the thought of watching you sacrifice everything for me. So you sacrificed everything for me instead." Reed's thumb had stopped moving across her knuckles, but he still hadn't let go of her hand. "Without asking if that's what I wanted, without giving me a choice in my own life." The accusation hung between them like a living thing, and Simone felt the weight of it settling into her bones. He was right. In trying to protect him, she'd taken away his agency, his right to make his own decisions about their future. She decided she knew what was best for both of them, and in doing so, she'd destroyed the trust that had been the foundation of their relationship. "You're right," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Reed. I know it doesn't change anything, but I've regretted it every day since. Every single day." The admission seemed to drain something out of both of them. Reed's grip on her hand loosened slightly, though he didn't let go completely, and some of the rigid tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the rain and processing the conversation that had just unraveled 5 years of carefully maintained emotional distance. "What now?" Simone asked finally, because she genuinely didn't know. They'd said the words that had needed saying, acknowledged the pain they'd caused each other. But where did that leave them? She was supposed to be on a date with his brother. He was supposed to be the successful CEO who'd moved on from their failed relationship. Instead, they were sitting in a cafe holding hands and crying over a love story that had ended before it had really begun. Reed was quiet for so long that Simone wondered if he'd heard her question. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he was weighing each word before allowing it to leave his lips. "Now we figure out how to exist in the same city without destroying each other," he said finally. Chapter 3. The rain continued its relentless assault against the cafe windows, each drop seeming to echo the uncertainty pounding in Simone's chest. Reed's words hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure either of them was brave enough to cross. Exist in the same city without destroying each other. It sounded so clinical, so carefully distant, when what she really wanted to ask was whether there might be a chance for something more. But she'd forfeited the right to hope for more 5 years ago when she'd chosen fear over faith. "I'm not staying long," she said quietly, though even as the words left her lips she realized how much she wanted them to be untrue. "Just a few months to oversee the Meridian Gallery's new acquisition. Then, I'll be going back to Paris." Something flickered across Reed's features, disappointment maybe, or relief. It was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure, but the brief glimpse of vulnerability reminded her that underneath the polished CEO exterior, he was still the man who'd worn his heart on his sleeve when it came to her. "Of course you are." Reed's smile was razor-sharp and didn't reach his eyes. "Running away is what you do best, after all." The barb hit its mark, and Simone flinched as if he'd struck her. But she couldn't argue with the assessment, because wasn't that exactly what she was doing? Planning her escape before she'd even fully arrived, maintaining the same pattern of self-protection that had governed her life since the day she'd left him, standing at the altar of their dreams. "That's not fair," she whispered, though they both knew it was completely fair. "Isn't it?" Reed leaned back against the booth's cushioned back, finally releasing her hand to cross his arms over his chest. The loss of contact felt like a physical ache, and Simone had to resist the urge to reach for him again. "You left 5 years ago without a real conversation. You're planning to leave again now. When exactly do you plan to stop running from the things that scare you?" The question hit her like a lightning bolt, illuminating truths she'd been avoiding for years. When did she plan to stop running? When did she plan to stop letting fear make her decisions? When did she plan to start living instead of just surviving? "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty in her voice seemed to surprise them both. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay." Something in Reed's expression softened at her confession. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface of his controlled facade gave way to something that looked almost like compassion, and for a moment, Simone caught a glimpse of the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Maybe it's time you learned," he said quietly. Before Simone could respond to that loaded suggestion, the cafe door burst open with a gust of wind and rain. A figure in a dark coat hurried inside, shaking water from an umbrella and scanning the room with a kind of purposeful energy that could only belong to someone important who was running late. Ryan Hastings. Simone recognized him immediately, though he'd changed from the college-aged kid she remembered from family photos into a man in his own right. He had Reed's height and the family's distinctive jawline, but where Reed was all controlled intensity, Ryan carried himself with an easy confidence that spoke of someone who'd never had his heart truly broken. Ryan's eyes found their corner booth, and his face lit up with the kind of smile that had probably been melting hearts since he'd learned to walk. He approached their table with long strides, completely oblivious to the emotional minefield he was about to step into. "Sorry I'm late," Ryan said cheerfully as he reached their table, his attention focused entirely on Simone. "Traffic was insane, and then the rain started, and I couldn't find parking." He trailed off as he noticed Reed sitting across from her, confusion flickering across his handsome features. "Reed, what are you doing here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Simone watched as realization slowly dawned on Ryan's face, his confused smile fading as he looked between his brother and the woman who was supposed to be his date. Reed, for his part, looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. "Ryan," Reed said carefully, rising from the booth with the kind of controlled movement that spoke of a man barely containing his emotions. "I need to explain." "Oh my God," Ryan's voice was barely above a whisper as understanding crashed over him like a wave. "Simone, you're her, the one who—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but they all knew what he'd been about to say. "You're the one who broke my brother's heart." Simone felt heat flood her cheeks as she stood as well, her purse clutched in her hands like a shield. This was exactly the kind of mortifying situation she'd spent her life trying to avoid, the kind of messy emotional complication that made her want to disappear into the floor. "I should go," she said quickly, already edging toward the aisle between tables. This is too complicated. I'm sorry, Ryan. I had no idea." "Wait." Ryan's voice stopped her mid-escape, and when she turned back to look at him, she was surprised to see understanding rather than anger in his eyes. "This is awkward as hell, but maybe it's not a coincidence. Maybe this is exactly what was supposed to happen." Reed stared at his brother like he'd lost his mind. "Ryan, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you've been miserable for 5 years, Ryan said with the kind of brutal honesty that only family could deliver. "I'm talking about the fact that you work yourself to death to avoid going home to an empty apartment. I'm talking about the fact that you've never even looked at another woman, let alone dated one." "Ryan." Reed's voice carried a warning, but his and younger brother was on a roll. "And I'm talking about the fact that the woman sitting across from you looks like she's been just as miserable as you have." Ryan turned to Simone with a gentle smile that was so different from Reed's intensity, but somehow just as compelling. "You didn't know it was Reed who arranged this date, did you?" Simone shook her head, not trusting her voice. "And you came anyway, even though you swore off dating after whatever happened 5 years ago that Jasmine won't tell me about." Ryan's smile widened. "Seems to me like the universe is trying to tell you both something." "The universe," Reed said dryly, "has a twisted sense of humor. Or maybe it's giving you both a second chance." Ryan pulled his coat tighter around himself and glanced toward the door. "Look, I'm going to leave you two to figure this out, but Reed, stop being such a stubborn ass. And Simone, stop running away from the best thing that ever happened to either of you." With that, Ryan Hastings turned and walked back out into the storm, leaving Reed and Simone staring after him in stunned silence. "Well," Reed said finally, sinking back into the booth, "that was mortifying," Simone finished, though she couldn't help but notice that some of the tension had drained out of the situation with Ryan's departure. His easy acceptance of the situation, his obvious affection for his brother, his gentle encouragement, it had all served to remind her that not everyone in Reed's family was like his mother. Actually, I was going to say enlightening, Reed replied, and when Simone looked at him, she was surprised to see something that might have been amusement in his eyes. Ryan's always been the romantic in the family. I used to think he was naive, but maybe he sees something the rest of us miss. Simone hesitated in the aisle, torn between her instinct to flee and the growing realization that running away wasn't solving anything. It hadn't solved anything 5 years ago, and it wouldn't solve anything now. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. Reed, she said softly, what if Ryan's right? What if this is supposed to mean something? Reed was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read her thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, as if he was afraid to hope. What are you saying? I'm saying, Simone took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I'm saying maybe we shouldn't let the past completely dictate our future. Maybe we owe it to ourselves to see if there's anything left worth saving. The words hung between them like a bridge she'd just built, fragile and uncertain, but there nonetheless. Reed's green eyes searched her face, and she could see the war between hope and self-preservation playing out in their depths. Simone, he said finally, I can't go through losing you again. I barely survived it the first time. The vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her heart. This was Reed, at his most honest, stripped of all the corporate armor and emotional walls he'd built to protect himself. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd been brave enough to offer her his whole heart, even though she'd already proven she might not be careful with it. Then maybe we don't have to think about losing each other, she said, surprised by her own boldness. Maybe we just think about coffee, dinner, conversation, taking it one day at a time and seeing what happens. Reed's smile was small and cautious, but it was real. Are you asking me out, Simone Montclair? Despite everything, the pain, the years of separation, the impossibility of their situation, Simone found herself smiling back. I think I am, Reed Hastings. In that case, Reed said, standing and extending his hand to her, would you like to get out of here? I know a place where we can talk without the ghosts of every date we ever had staring at us from the walls. Simone looked at his outstretched hand, and for a moment she was 25 again, standing in an art gallery and feeling her world shift on its axis because of a man with green eyes and a smile that promised forever. The smart thing would be to politely decline, to maintain the distance that would protect them both from further heartbreak. But maybe, just this once, she could choose brave over smart. She took his hand. The rain had softened to a gentle patter by the time they left the cafe, and Reed's car, a sleek black sedan that screamed success, was parked just down the block. He opened the passenger door for her with the same old-fashioned courtesy she remembered, and as she settled into the leather seat that smelled faintly of his cologne, Simone felt like she was stepping into a time machine. Where are we going? She asked as Reed started the engine, his hands steady on the steering wheel despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. My place, Reed said, then quickly added, to talk. Just to talk. I have the best coffee in the city and no memories of us there because I moved after you left. The admission that he'd moved, presumably because their shared spaces had become too painful, sent a fresh wave of guilt through Simone's system. How many ways had her leaving changed his life? How many small decisions had been shaped by the absence she'd created? Okay, she said softly. But Reed, I need you to know that I can't promise anything beyond tonight. I can't promise I won't get scared again or that I won't hurt you again. I can only promise that I'll try to be honest with you. Reed's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment, Simone thought he might change his mind, might decide the risk was too great. But when he looked at her, his green eyes were determined. Then that's where we start, he said, with honesty. As they drove through the rain-washed streets toward Reed's penthouse, Simone found herself thinking about Ryan's words. Maybe the universe was trying to tell them something. Maybe some love stories were worth fighting for, even when, especially when, the odds seemed impossible. Have you ever had to choose between family approval and true love? These impossible decisions shape us in ways we never expect. Share your thoughts with our community below. But as the city lights blurred past her window and Reed's presence filled the small space of the car with possibilities she'd thought were lost forever, Simone began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were about to write a different ending to their story, one that didn't end with someone running away. Reed's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming high-rise that hadn't even existed when they'd been together. As the private elevator climbed toward the clouds, Simone felt her stomach flutter with a mixture of nerves and anticipation that had nothing to do with the height and everything to do with the man standing beside her. The doors opened to reveal a space that was undeniably Reed's, clean lines, expensive furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city sprawling below them. But it was also completely impersonal, like a high-end hotel suite rather than someone's home. There were no family photos on the mantel, no personal touches that spoke of the man who lived here, no signs that this was anything more than a place to sleep between long days at the office. "It's beautiful," Simone said politely, though what she really meant was that it was empty. This wasn't the warm, lived-in space where Reed had once displayed her paintings and kept fresh flowers because he knew they made her smile. This was the home of a man who'd given up on the things that made a house feel like a sanctuary. "It serves its purpose," Reed replied, shrugging out of his suit jacket and draping it over a chair. The simple action revealed the strong lines of his shoulders beneath his white dress shirt, and Simone had to look away before he caught her staring. "Which is?" "Impressing clients, hosting business dinners, providing a place to sleep when I'm too tired to drive home to the family estate." Reed's smile was self-deprecating. "Not exactly what you'd call a home, is it?" The sadness in his voice made Simone's chest ache. This wasn't the Reed she'd known, the one who'd talked about creating a space filled with warmth and laughter and love. This was a man who'd forgotten how to want those things, or maybe who'd convinced himself he didn't deserve them. "It could be," she said softly. "With the right touches. Some art on the walls, maybe. Plants, books that aren't related to business." Reed's laugh was hollow. "I wouldn't know where to start. I haven't bought a book for pleasure in 5 years. And as for art," he gestured helplessly, "I wouldn't trust my taste anymore." The confession hit Simone like a physical blow. Reed had always loved art, had been the one to introduce her to galleries and artists she'd never heard of. He'd had an eye for beauty that had rivaled her professional training, an instinct for pieces that spoke to the soul rather than just the intellect. To hear that he'd lost that part of himself, or abandoned it, was almost unbearable. "Reed," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to acknowledge the loss. "Coffee?" Reed interrupted, moving toward the kitchen with quick, efficient movements that suggested he was as uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation as she was. "I promised you the best coffee in the city, and I always keep my promises." The kitchen was as pristine and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that looked like they'd never been used for anything more elaborate than reheating takeout. Reed moved around the space with practiced efficiency, pulling out an expensive espresso machine and beginning the ritual of making coffee with the kind of focused attention he'd once reserved for more intimate activities. Simone watched him work, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he avoided looking at her directly. This was harder for him than he was letting on, she realized, being alone with her in his private space, trying to navigate a conversation that had the potential to either heal old wounds or tear them open even wider. "You can sit," Reed said without turning around, "unless you're planning to bolt for the door the moment my back is turned." The gentle teasing in his voice was so familiar, it made her heart clench. This was the Reed she remembered, the one who could defuse tension with humor, who knew exactly how to make her smile even when she was being difficult. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, settling onto one of the bar stools that lined the kitchen island. "I told you I'd try to be honest, and part of that honesty is admitting that I don't want to run anymore. I'm tired, Reed. I'm tired of living half a life." Reed's hands stilled on the espresso machine, and for a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant whisper of rain against the windows. "Half a life," he repeated quietly. "That's exactly what it's been, hasn't it? For both of us." "Yes." The admission came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of 5 years of carefully suppressed longing. I thought if I stayed busy enough, successful enough, if I traveled to enough places and met enough people, I could fill the space you left behind. But it never worked. Nothing ever worked. Reed turned to face her then, his green eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable and somehow safe all at the same time. "Do you know what the worst part was?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "It wasn't the anger or the hurt or even the confusion about why you'd left. It was the hope. For months I kept thinking you'd come back. Every time my phone rang, every time someone knocked on my door, every time I saw a woman with dark hair on the street, my heart would stop because I thought it might be you." Tears spilled down Simone's cheeks before she could stop them. "Reed, please." "And then the hope died," he continued, as if he hadn't heard her plea. "And that was somehow worse because as long as I was hoping, part of you was still with me. When the hope died, you were really gone." The pain in his voice was so raw, so honest, that Simone felt like she was drowning in the magnitude of what her leaving had cost them both. She'd thought she was saving him from a difficult choice, but instead, she'd condemned them both to years of emotional exile. "I never stopped hoping," she whispered through her tears. "That's why I never came back. Because I knew if I saw you again, if I heard your voice or felt your touch, I'd never be strong enough to walk away a second time. And I still believed you were better off without me." Reed crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides, coming to stand in front of her with an urgency that made her pulse quicken. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the intensity burning in his eyes. "Look at me," he said firmly. "Really look at me, Simone. Do I look better off without you? Do I look like a man who's living his best life?" She studied his face, really studied it, taking in the lines of stress around his eyes, the tight set of his jaw, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes anymore. This wasn't the vibrant, passionate man she'd fallen in love with. This was someone who'd learned to function without joy, to exist without truly living. "No," she whispered, "you look like I feel empty." "Then maybe," Reed said, his voice soft but determined, "it's time we stopped punishing ourselves for a mistake you made when you were scared and young and convinced you were doing the right thing." The warmth of his hands against her skin was intoxicating, and Simone found herself leaning into his touch despite every self-preservation instinct screaming at her to maintain distance. This was dangerous territory, the kind of emotional intimacy that had always been their downfall, because it made everything else seem unimportant by comparison. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "I'm saying I want to try again," Reed said, his green eyes never leaving hers. "I'm saying I've spent 5 years trying to convince myself I could live without you, and I can't. I'm saying that seeing you tonight, talking to you, being close to you, it's the first time I've felt alive since you left." The confession hung between them like a bridge, beautiful and terrifying and impossible to ignore. Simone felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling like sandcastles in the tide, and for the first time in 5 years, she allowed herself to really look at what she wanted instead of what she thought was practical or safe or right. She wanted Reed. She wanted his laughter and his passion and his unwavering belief that love could conquer any obstacle if you were brave enough to fight for it. She wanted lazy Sunday mornings and heated debates about art and the way he hummed unconsciously when he was content. She wanted the life they'd planned together, the one she'd thrown away because she'd been too scared to believe she deserved it. "Reed," she whispered, her voice shaking with the magnitude of what she was about to say. "I want that too, more than I've ever wanted anything, but I need you to know that I'm different now. The girl you fell in love with, she doesn't exist anymore." Reed's smile was soft and sad and beautiful. "Good," he said, "because the man you fell in love with is gone too. We're both different now, Simone. The question is whether the people we've become can love each other as much as the people we used to be." And then, before she could lose her nerve or talk herself out of it or remember all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, Simone rose from the bar stool and kissed him. It was supposed to be gentle, tentative, a careful exploration of whether the spark between them had survived 5 years of separation. But the moment their lips touched, 5 years of longing and regret and desperate love exploded between them like a dam bursting. Chapter 4. Reed's response was immediate and devastating. His arms came around her like he was drowning, and she was his only hope of salvation, pulling her against him with a desperation that spoke of 5 years of starvation. She could taste the salt of her own tears on his lips, could feel the tremor in his hands as they buried themselves in her hair, and suddenly she was 25 again, standing in a gallery and falling in love with a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Reed rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if he was trying to memorize the moment. "We're going to take this slow," he said, his voice rough with emotion and desire. "We're going to talk about everything, the past, the present, what we both want for the future. We're going to be honest about our fears and our hopes and all the ways we've changed. And we're going to build something real this time, something that can withstand whatever obstacles the world throws at us." Simone nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The rational part of her brain was screaming warnings about moving too fast, about the impossibility of overcoming 5 years of hurt and separation in a single evening. But her heart, her foolish, optimistic heart that had never stopped loving this man, was singing with possibility. "But first," Reed continued, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with reverent gentleness, "I need to know that you're serious about this. I need to know that you won't disappear the moment things get complicated or difficult. Because they will get complicated, Simone. My family, your career, the fact that we're both carrying scars from what happened before, none of that has magically disappeared." "I know," Simone whispered, covering his hand with hers, "and I can't promise it will be easy, or that I won't get scared again. But I can promise that I'll talk to you about it instead of running away. I can promise that I'll fight for us this time instead of giving up before we've even tried." Reed's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming his entire face and reminding her of all the reasons she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. "Then let's start with dinner," he said, stepping back just enough to break the spell of physical contact that was making it hard for either of them to think clearly. "I'll cook. And before you make that face, yes, I learned how to cook properly after you left. It turns out that microwaved meals get depressing after the first year." Simone laughed, despite the tears still clinging to her lashes, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. When was the last time she'd laughed like that, free and genuine and full of joy? When was the last time anything had felt this right? "I'd like that," she said. "But Reed, can I ask you something first?" "Anything. Why did you really arrange this date for Ryan? I mean, I know you care about his happiness, but there was something else, wasn't there? Some other reason you wanted him to meet someone special." Reed was quiet for a long moment, his hands busy with the abandoned coffee preparation as he considered his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, as if he was afraid to admit something that might make him seem weak. "Because I wanted to prove to myself that I believed in love," he said finally. "For 5 years I've been this cynical, emotionally unavailable CEO who told himself that romantic love was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Ryan still believes in happily ever after. He still thinks that finding the right person can change everything. And I wanted him to have that, partly because I love him, but mostly because I needed to believe it was still possible." The admission hit Simone like a physical blow. "Oh, Reed." "Pathetic, right?" Reed's laugh was self-deprecating. "The man who gave up on love trying to orchestrate it for someone else?" "Not pathetic," Simone said firmly, hopeful. "Even when you thought you'd lost everything, part of you was still fighting to believe in the possibility of happiness. That's not pathetic, Reed. That's beautiful." Reed looked up from the coffee machine, his green eyes vulnerable in a way that reminded her of the young man who'd proposed to her in a garden full of flowers. "You always did see the best in people," he said softly, "even when they couldn't see it in themselves." Only when it's really there, Simone replied. And it's definitely there, Reed. It always has been. They were treading dangerous emotional territory again, the kind of intimacy that had always been their greatest strength and their most devastating weakness. But this time, instead of running from it, Simone forced herself to stay present, to lean into the discomfort of vulnerability, and trust that Reed would handle her heart more carefully than she'd handled his. "Tell me about your life," Reed said, apparently sensing the same need to ground their conversation in safer territory. "The real version, not the sanitized highlights you'd put in a Christmas card. What's it really been like?" Simone settled back onto the bar stool, accepting the perfect espresso he offered her with a grateful smile. The first sip was heaven, rich and complex and exactly the way she remembered loving it. And for a moment, she could almost pretend they were just two people getting to know each other for the first time, instead of two former lovers trying to navigate the minefield of their shared history. "Lonely," she said honestly. "Professionally fulfilling, but personally empty. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that didn't hurt. I became really good at my job, better than I ever thought I could be. But I never formed any real connections. I had colleagues and acquaintances and people I went to gallery openings with, but no real friends. No one who knew me the way you used to know me. No relationships at all?" Reed's voice was carefully casual, but Simone could hear the underlying tension in the question. "A few," she admitted, because honesty was the foundation they were trying to build on. "Nothing serious, nothing that lasted more than a few months. I kept comparing everyone to—" She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. "To me?" Reed supplied, and when she nodded, his smile was sad but somehow pleased. "Good, because I never even tried. Couldn't see the point when I knew no one could measure up to what we'd had." The confession sent warmth spreading through Simone's chest, followed immediately by a sharp pang of regret. 5 years. They'd wasted 5 years they could have spent together. 5 years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings that would have been extraordinary simply because they were shared. "We can't get that time back," Reed said, reading her thoughts with the uncanny accuracy she remembered. "But we can decide what we do with the time we have left." "Is that what you want?" Simone asked. "To try again?" "Really? Because, Reed, I need to be absolutely clear about what I'm walking into here. Are you talking about dating? About seeing where things go? Or are you talking about—" "Forever," Reed said without hesitation. "I'm talking about forever, Simone. I'm talking about the life we planned before everything fell apart. I'm talking about marriage and children and growing old together and all the things I convinced myself I didn't want because I couldn't have them with you." The intensity of his declaration took her, breath away. This wasn't casual dating or testing the waters. This was Reed laying his entire heart on the line, offering her everything she'd ever wanted and been too scared to take. That's a lot of pressure," she managed. "I know. And I'm not saying we have to make those decisions tonight or even this month. I'm just saying that's what I want, what I'm hoping for. If you can't see yourself wanting the same thing eventually, then we should probably stop this before we hurt each other again." Simone stared into her coffee cup, watching the steam rise and trying to process the magnitude of what Reed was offering. Marriage, children, a future she'd dreamed about for 5 years but never allowed herself to hope for. It was everything she wanted, and everything that terrified her, wrapped up in the form of a man who'd already proven he could break her heart. But wasn't that true of any love worth having? Didn't it require the courage to be vulnerable, to trust someone else with your happiness, to believe that the joy was worth the risk? "I want that too," she said quietly, the words feeling like both a confession and a promise. "I want everything we talked about before, the house with the big kitchen and the art studio and the converted barn, the Sunday morning farmers markets and the family dinners, and the tradition of taking dance lessons even though we're both terrible at it." Reed's smile could have powered the city. "You remember all that?" "I remember everything," Simone said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised her. "Every dream we shared, every plan we made, every promise we gave each other. I've carried all of it with me for 5 years, and it's never stopped feeling like the life I was supposed to have." Then let's have it, Reed said simply. Let's stop punishing ourselves for past mistakes and start building the future we both want. It sounded so easy when he put it like that, as if love and commitment were simple choices rather than terrifying leaps of faith. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the complexity was something they'd created, and the solution was as straightforward as deciding to choose each other over their fears. Okay, Simone said, the word carrying more weight than any wedding vow. Okay, let's try. Reed's kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, a gentle seal on the pact they'd just made. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling, and for the first time in 5 years, Simone felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Now, Reed said, rolling up his sleeves with the kind of determined efficiency that had made him a legend in the business world, let me show you what I've learned about cooking. Fair warning, it's going to be much better than anything I used to make, but I still can't promise it will be as good as your grandmother's soup recipe. Simone laughed, the sound bright and natural in the quiet kitchen. I still have that recipe, you know. I've been carrying it around for 5 years, thinking maybe someday I'd find someone worth cooking it for again. And did you? Find someone worth cooking it for? No, Simone said, watching Reed pull ingredients from the refrigerator with the kind of focused attention he'd once brought to memorizing her body. But maybe I was looking in the wrong places. Maybe the person I was supposed to cook it for was right here all along. Reed paused in his meal preparation, a bunch of fresh herbs in his hands, and an expression of such tender hope on his face that Simone felt her heart skip several beats. Maybe, he agreed softly. Maybe he was. As Reed began to cook, and he had indeed learned to do it properly, moving around the kitchen with the same controlled competence he brought to everything else, Simone found herself studying the man he'd become. The changes weren't just in his cooking skills or his expanded real estate portfolio. He was more contained now, more careful with his words and emotions, as if he'd learned to protect himself from the kind of devastating heartbreak she'd inflicted. But underneath the caution, she could see glimpses of the man she'd fallen in love with. The way his face lit up when he successfully flipped something in a pan. The unconscious humming that started when he was content. The way he kept glancing at her as if he couldn't quite believe she was really there. Tell me about your family, Simone said as Reed seasoned what looked like an incredibly sophisticated pasta dish. How are your parents? How did they react when you became the CEO your father always wanted you to be? Reed's movement stilled for just a moment, and Simone knew she'd hit on something complicated. Chapter 5. My father was thrilled, Reed said carefully, his attention focused on stirring the sauce with more concentration than it probably required. I became everything he'd groomed me to be, ruthless when necessary, focused on profit margins, unencumbered by personal complications that might interfere with business decisions. The perfect corporate heir. Simone heard the bitterness beneath his controlled tone and felt another stab of guilt. And your mother? Reed's laugh was sharp enough to cut. My mother got exactly what she wanted too. A son who learned to prioritize family expectations over personal happiness. A son who understood that duty comes before desire and that some people are just better suited to our way of life than others. The words hit Simone like physical blows, each one a reminder of the poison Marge Hastings had whispered in her ear 5 years ago. But hearing them from Reed's lips, understanding how completely his mother's prejudices had shaped his understanding of love and worth, made her anger flare bright and hot. Reed, she said quietly, what your mother said about me, about us, none of that was true. Wasn't it? Reed turned to face her, his green eyes dark with old pain. Look at what happened, Simone. Look at how easily our relationship crumbled the moment it faced real opposition. Maybe she was right. Maybe we weren't as strong as we thought we were. No. Simone stood up from the bar stool, moving to stand closer to him, needing him to hear what she was about to say. What destroyed us wasn't weakness in our relationship. It was my weakness, my inability to trust that what we had was stronger than other people's opinions. Your mother was wrong about me, but she was especially wrong about you. Reed's hands stilled on the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir the sauce. What do you mean? I mean, the man I fell in love with wouldn't have chosen family approval over his own happiness. The Reed I knew would have fought for us, would have stood up to his family and made his own choices about his life. Your mother counted on my insecurities to drive me away because she knew that if it came down to a direct confrontation, you would have chosen me. Reed stared at her for a long moment, and Simone could see him processing her words, testing them against his memories of that devastating time. You really believe that? He asked finally. I know it, Simone said with absolute certainty, because I've spent 5 years replaying every conversation we ever had about our future, and never once, not once, did you suggest that your family's approval mattered more than our happiness. You were prepared to build a life with me, regardless of what anyone else thought. I'm the one who got scared and ran instead of trusting you to keep your promises. Something shifted in Reed's expression, a loosening of tension he'd probably been carrying for years. All this time I thought maybe she was right. Maybe I was being selfish, choosing my happiness over family unity. Maybe I was asking too much of you, expecting you to fit into a world that didn't want you. You were asking me to love you, Simone said simply, and to trust that your love was strong enough to handle whatever challenges we faced together. That wasn't too much to ask, Reed. That was everything I wanted to give you. I just wasn't brave enough. Reed set down the spoon and reached for her, his hands framing her face with the same tender reverence he'd shown her in the cafe. And now? Are you brave enough now? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Simone felt the weight of 5 years of regret and longing pressing down on her shoulders. Was she brave enough? Brave enough to love a man whose family might never accept her? Brave enough to trust that this time, when obstacles arose, they could face them together instead of letting them tear them apart? I don't know, she admitted, because honesty was the foundation they were trying to build. But I want to be. I want to be the woman who fights for what she wants instead of running away from it. I want to be worthy of the love you're offering me. You already are, Reed said firmly. You always were, Simone. The only person who ever questioned your worth was you. Before she could respond to that devastating observation, Reed's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. He glanced at it with annoyance, clearly planning to ignore it, but his expression changed when he saw the caller ID. It's my mother, he said, and something in his voice made Simone's stomach clench with dread. Answer it, she said, though every instinct was screaming at her to tell him to ignore the call. She might need something important. Reed hesitated for a moment, then swiped to accept the call. Hello, Mother. Even from several feet away, Simone could hear Marge Hastings's voice through the phone, sharp with indignation and barely controlled anger. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. This was a woman who was very displeased about something. Yes, I know about Ryan's date, Reed said calmly, though Simone could see the tension building in his shoulders. How did you? Paris told you? He listened for another moment, then sighed. Mother, I can explain. The one-sided conversation continued for several more minutes, with Reed's responses becoming increasingly clipped and controlled. Simone watched his transformation from the warm, open man she'd been talking with, back into the armored CEO who could weather any storm, and her heart sank as she realized what was happening. Someone, probably Paris Olsen, his chief of staff, had seen them together and reported back to his family. The protective bubble they'd been living in for the past few hours was about to burst, and the real world was crashing back in with all its complications and demands. No, Mother, Reed said finally, his voice carrying a note of steel that Simone had never heard directed at his family before. I will not be at dinner tomorrow night to discuss this, and I will not be bringing anyone for you to meet and approve of. My personal life is no longer subject to family committee review. The silence that followed this declaration was deafening, even from Simone's distance across the kitchen. She could practically feel Marge Hastings's shock radiating through the phone, followed quickly by the kind of icy fury that had once sent Simone fleeing rather than face it directly. That's your choice, Reed continued, his voice remaining steady despite what was clearly a barrage of threats and ultimatums from his mother. But it's a choice you'll have to live with, because I'm done letting fear of your disapproval control my decisions. When Reed finally ended the call and set his phone aside, his hands were shaking slightly. He stood with his back to Simone for a long moment, and she could see him gathering himself, preparing for whatever confrontation was surely coming. "She knows," he said finally, without turning around. "Paris saw us leave Meridian Cafe together and thought she should give my mother a heads up about my concerning behavior." "Reed, I'm sorry," Simone began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't apologize. This isn't your fault. This is exactly the kind of interference I should have shut down 5 years ago." Reed turned to face her, his green eyes blazing with a determination she'd never seen before. "But I'm shutting it down now." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done being the dutiful son who puts family expectations ahead of his own happiness. It means I'm done letting my mother dictate who I can and can't love. And it means that if my family can't accept the woman I choose to spend my life with, then they'll have to learn to live without me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent warmth flooding through Simone's chest, but it was immediately followed by panic. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of 5 years ago, that loving her would cost Reed his family, his support system, his place in the world he'd been born into. "Reed, no," she said quickly. "You can't choose between me and your family. That's not fair to anyone, and it's not what I want." "What you want?" Reed's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Simone, 5 years ago you made a decision about what was best for both of us without consulting me. You decided that preserving my relationship with my family was more important than preserving our relationship with each other. Are you really going to make that same mistake again?" The accusation hit home because it was completely accurate. She was doing exactly what she'd done before, making decisions about their future based on her fears instead of trusting Reed to handle his own family relationships. "That's not what I'm doing," she protested, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. "Isn't it?" Reed moved closer, his intensity filling the space between them. "You're already calculating the cost, aren't you? Already deciding that loving you isn't worth the trouble it might cause, already preparing to run away again rather than fight for what we want." Simone opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again because what could she say? He was right. The moment his mother's disapproval had crashed back into their evening, all her old insecurities had roared back to life. All her fears about not being good enough, not being worth the complications she brought to his life, not deserving the kind of love that could weather any storm. "I don't want to hurt you again," she whispered. "Then don't leave," Reed said simply. "Stay and fight with me this time. Trust me to handle my family. Trust us to be stronger than their disapproval." The plea in his voice nearly broke her heart. This was Reed at his most vulnerable, asking her to have faith in their love even when the odds seemed impossible. This was the moment that would define everything. Would she choose fear or faith? Would she run again, or would she finally find the courage to stay and fight for the life she wanted? "Your mother hates me," Simone said, grasping for logical reasons to protect them both from the pain that seemed inevitable. "She thinks I'm beneath your family, that I'll hold you back, that I'm not worthy of the Hastings name. How do we fight against that kind of fundamental rejection?" "We prove her wrong," Reed said with absolute conviction. "We build a life so full of love and joy and purpose that it becomes impossible to deny what we have together. We show her that worth isn't measured by family connections or trust fund balances, but by how much two people can love each other and the life they create together. And if she never comes around, if choosing me means losing your family forever?" Reed was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same serious attention he'd give to any major business decision. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Then I'll build a new family," he said, "with you. And maybe with Ryan, if he can stand up to the pressure. And definitely with our children, who will grow up knowing that love is the most important thing, not social status or family approval." The casual mention of their hypothetical children sent a jolt of longing through Simone so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. She could see it suddenly, a little girl with Reed's green eyes and her own stubborn chin, a boy with his father's protective nature and his mother's artistic soul. Children who would grow up secure in their parents' love, never doubting their worth or their place in the world. "You make it sound so simple," she said through the tears that had started falling again. "Because it is simple," Reed replied, reaching for her hands and holding them gently. "Not easy, but simple. We love each other. We want to build a life together. Everything else, family drama, social expectations, other people's opinions, it's all just noise. It only has as much power as we give it." "I'm scared," Simone admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "I know, I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of losing you again than I am of anything my family might do." Reed brought her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. "We can be scared together, Simone. We just can't let the fear make our decisions for us." Before Simone could respond, Reed's phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID showed Ryan's name, and Reed answered it immediately. "Ryan? Is everything okay?" Simone could hear Ryan's voice through the phone, urgent and slightly breathless, though she couldn't make out the words. Reed's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. "She what?" Reed's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Ryan, slow down. Tell me exactly what happened." Another pause, more urgent conversation from Ryan's end. "No, don't come here," Reed said firmly. "Go to your apartment and stay there. I'll handle this." He listened for another moment, then said, "Ryan, I need you to trust me on this. Everything's going to be fine, but I need to deal with Mother myself." When Reed ended the call, his face was pale, but determined. "What happened?" Simone asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "My mother called an emergency family meeting," Reed said grimly. "She's demanding that everyone gather at the estate immediately to discuss my concerning behavior and inappropriate associations. She's threatening to have the board remove me from my position as president if I don't end this relationship immediately." The words hit Simone like a physical blow. This was her worst nightmare coming true. Loving Reed was going to cost him everything he'd worked for, everything his family had built. She'd brought chaos into his carefully ordered life, just like his mother had always said she would. "Reed," she began, but he cut her off. "No," he said firmly. "Whatever you're about to say, whatever noble sacrifice you're planning to make, the answer is no. I'm not letting my mother manipulate us into giving up our happiness to protect her social standing. But your position as president, the company, can all be replaced," Reed finished. "You can't be. What we have together can't be. I've spent 5 years learning that lesson the hard way, and I'm not forgetting it now." Reed pulled out his phone again, scrolling through his contacts with the kind of focused determination that had made him legendary in business negotiations. "What are you doing?" Simone asked. "Calling my attorney," Reed replied. "If my mother wants to play hardball, she's going to learn that I've become very good at winning games I don't want to play." As Reed waited for his call to connect, Simone felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. This was the moment of truth. Would she stand beside Reed as he fought for their future? Or would she let her fears drive her away again? For 5 years, she'd told herself that leaving had been an act of love, a way to protect Reed from having to choose between her and his family. But looking at him now, seeing the man he'd become when he was forced to live without love, she finally understood the truth. She hadn't protected him by leaving, she'd broken him. And if she left again now, when he was finally ready to fight for their happiness, she'd be breaking them both beyond repair. "Reed," she said quietly, and something in her voice made him pause in his conversation with his attorney. "Hold on, James," Reed said into the phone, then looked at Simone with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror. "What is it?" "I'm staying," Simone said, the words feeling like both a surrender and a victory. "I'm not running this time. Whatever happens with your family, whatever it costs us, we'll face it together." Reed's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, transforming his entire face and reminding her of all the reasons she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. "James," Reed said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Simone's face, "I need you to prepare a defense strategy for a potential board challenge to my presidency. And James, Make it bulletproof. I have something worth fighting for now." As Reed continued his conversation with his attorney, laying out strategies and contingency plans with the same ruthless efficiency that had built his reputation, Simone felt something settling into place in her chest, a sense of rightness she'd been missing for 5 years. This was what love looked like when you were brave enough to fight for it. Not the fairy tale romance of easy choices and universal approval, but the hard-won happiness that came from choosing each other over and over again, regardless of what the world thought about your decisions. Have you ever had to choose between family approval and true love? These impossible decisions shape us in ways we never expect. Share your thoughts with our community below. Reed ended his call and immediately reached for Simone, pulling her into his arms with a fierce possessiveness that made her heart race. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. My family will do everything they can to destroy what we're building, and it's going to get ugly before it gets better." "I'm sure," Simone said, and for the first time in 5 years, she really was. "I love you, Reed Hastings. I've loved you for 5 years, and I'll love you for 50 more if you'll let me. And I'm done letting other people's opinions dictate how we live our lives." Reed's kiss was desperate and grateful and full of promise, a seal on the pact they'd just made to choose love over fear, happiness over approval, each other over everything else the world might try to offer them. When they finally broke apart, both, breathing hard, Reed rested his forehead against hers and smiled with the kind of pure joy she hadn't seen from him since before she'd left. "Then let's go build the life we've always wanted," he said softly, "and let anyone who doesn't like it try to stop us." Outside, the storm that had brought them together was finally beginning to clear, leaving behind the kind of washed clean air that promised new beginnings. And for the first time in 5 years, Simone allowed herself to believe that some storms were worth weathering, especially when you didn't have to face them alone. Chapter 6. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, family confrontations, and stolen moments of happiness that felt precious because they'd been so hard-won. True to her word, Marge Hastings had declared war on their relationship with the kind of calculated precision that made it clear where Reed had inherited his strategic mind. She'd rallied the board of directors, called in favors from old family friends, and even attempted to freeze Reed's access to company accounts. But Reed had been preparing for this battle longer than anyone realized. 5 years of building his own reputation, cultivating independent relationships, and proving his worth beyond his family name had given him resources his mother hadn't anticipated. When the dust settled from the attempted board coup, Reed emerged not only unscathed but stronger than before, having secured the loyalty of key board members who respected his leadership more than they feared Marge Hastings's disapproval. Dr. Samuel Hastings, meanwhile, had surprised everyone by refusing to take sides in the family war. During a tense dinner at the estate, one of the few family gatherings Reed still attended, he'd quietly told his wife that perhaps it was time to let their sons make their own choices about their lives. "I've watched Reed build something extraordinary with this company," he'd said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent his entire life studying human nature. "And I've watched him turn into a shell of himself without the woman he loves. Maybe it's time we asked ourselves whether our approval is worth more than our son's happiness." The conversation had ended with Marge storming out of the room, but it had also marked the beginning of a fragile peace between Reed and his father. It wasn't the enthusiastic support they might have hoped for, but it was acknowledgement that their love was real and worth fighting for. Ryan, predictably, had become their most vocal champion within the family. He'd started bringing Simone to family events as his guest, claiming he needed a friend who understood art to help him navigate gallery openings and cultural fundraisers. It was a transparent strategy to force his mother to interact with Simone in social settings, but it was also Ryan's way of showing his brother that love shouldn't have to be hidden or apologized for. Paris Olsen had taken longer to come around, her protective instincts warring with her genuine affection for Reed and her growing respect for Simone's obvious devotion to him. But the day Simone had arrived at Reed's office with homemade soup when he'd been battling a particularly nasty case of flu, Paris had quietly added her to Reed's calendar as family rather than visitor. She makes him happy, Paris had told Ryan when he'd asked about her change of heart. After 5 years of watching him barely exist, seeing him actually live again is worth whatever complications she brings with her. The complications, as it turned out, were less dramatic than anyone had anticipated. Yes, there were social events where certain families made their disapproval known through pointed snubs and strategic guest list exclusions. Yes, there were business relationships that became strained when associates chose sides in the Hastings family drama. But there were also unexpected allies, people who admired Reed's courage in choosing love over convenience, couples who saw their relationship as an example of what real partnership could look like. 6 months after their reunion at Meridian Cafe, Reed proposed again. Not in the family garden where they'd once planned their future, but in Simone's makeshift art studio in his penthouse, a space they'd created together, filling the sterile apartment with canvases and easels and the kind of beautiful chaos that made a house feel like a home. The ring was different too, not the vintage Art Deco piece she'd left behind 5 years ago, but something they'd designed together, a custom setting that incorporated stones from his grandmother's necklace and a band engraved with coordinates marking every place they'd fallen in love. The gallery where they'd met, the cafe where they'd reunited, the quiet corner of his kitchen where they'd chosen each other over their fears. "I know we already said yes to forever," Reed had said as he knelt among her paintings, the late afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and turning everything golden. "But I wanted to ask properly this time. Will you marry me, Simone Montclair? Will you be my wife and my partner and the mother of my children and the love of my life for as long as we both shall live?" Simone's yes had been breathless and immediate, followed by tears of joy and laughter and the kind of kiss that promised forever. When they'd finally broken apart, both shaking with the magnitude of the moment, Reed had slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled with reverence. "Perfect fit," he'd whispered, and they'd both known he wasn't just talking about the ring. Their wedding, 3 months later, was everything their first attempt hadn't been, intimate and personal and focused entirely on the love they shared rather than the expectations of others. They'd chosen the same garden where Reed had originally proposed, but they'd made it their own, filling it with wildflowers and string lights and the artwork of local artists Simone had discovered during her months back in the city. Marge Hastings had not attended, though she'd sent a formal wedding gift, a set of crystal stemware that had belonged to Reed's great-grandmother, along with a note that simply said, "For your happiness." It wasn't an apology or an acceptance, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that was enough to build on. Dr. Samuel had walked Simone down the aisle at her request, his quiet dignity and genuine warmth, providing the fatherly presence she'd missed since her own father's death years earlier. Ryan had served as Reed's best man, of course, and his toast had brought tears to everyone's eyes when he'd talked about watching his brother become human again after years of merely existing. "Love like this," Ryan had said, raising his glass to the small gathering of family and friends who'd come to celebrate with them. "Love like this reminds us all what we're fighting for, not just happiness, but the courage to believe we deserve it." As Reed and Simone had danced their first dance as husband and wife, to the same song that had been playing in the gallery the night they'd met, Simone had felt a sense of completion she'd been missing for 5 years. This was their real beginning, the start of the life they'd always been meant to live together. "No regrets?" Reed had whispered against her ear as they'd swayed together under the stars, surrounded by the laughter and conversation of the people who loved them most. "Only one," Simone had replied, smiling up at the man who'd waited for her to find her courage. "That it took us so long to get here." "We got here when we were supposed to," Reed had said with the wisdom of a man who'd learned to trust in timing and fate and the kind of love that survives anything. "We had to become the people who were brave enough to fight for this." Now, 18 months after their wedding, as Simone sat in the nursery they'd created in what had once been Reed's sterile home office, She marveled at how completely their lives had transformed. The walls were painted in soft yellows and greens, filled with children's books and handmade mobiles and a rocking chair that had belonged to Reed's grandmother. Through the window, she could see the garden they'd planted together, where vegetables grew alongside flowers and herbs, creating the kind of abundant beauty that came from love and patience and faith in things unseen. Reed appeared in the doorway, still in his work clothes, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the expression of contentment that had become his default since they'd found their way back to each other. "How's our daughter today?" he asked, settling into the chair beside hers and placing a gentle hand on her rounded belly, where their baby was already making her presence known with frequent kicks and restless movements. "Active," Simone replied, covering his hand with hers and feeling their daughter respond to her father's voice with what felt like recognition. "I think she's going to be just like her daddy. Always in motion, always planning the next big project." "God help us," Reed said with a laugh, then leaned down to press a soft kiss to Simone's belly. "Be gentle with your mama, little one. She's had enough adventure for one lifetime." "Are you kidding?" Simone said, threading her fingers through Reed's hair as he rested his head against her shoulder. "This is the best adventure I've ever been on." And it was true. Every challenge they'd faced, every obstacle they'd overcome, every moment of doubt they'd worked through together had led them to this. A love that was stronger for having been tested, a partnership that was deeper for having been earned, and a future that stretched out before them, bright with possibility. The baby kicked again, and Reed lifted his head to meet Simone's eyes, his green gaze soft with wonder and anticipation. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of every promise they'd made and every dream they'd dared to share. "I love you too," Simone replied, and settled back to watch the sunset paint their nursery in shades of gold and rose, knowing that some stories are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth believing in even when the odds seem impossible. Because sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, the love you thought you'd lost forever finds its way back to you. And when it does, it's sweeter for having been missed, stronger for having been tested, and more precious for having been chosen again and again and again. Outside their window, the garden bloomed with the promise of spring. And inside their home, the future they'd dreamed of was finally, beautifully, perfectly real. Reed and Simone's story reminds us that the deepest love often requires the greatest courage. Have you ever had to choose between playing it safe and fighting for your heart's desire? What gave you the strength to make that choice? Share your story with our Dear Love Diaries family in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Sometimes the universe conspires to give us second chances at the love we thought we'd lost forever. Sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the courage to begin again, to trust again, to believe that some love stories are strong enough to survive anything, even our own fears. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who believes in the power of true love. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Tomorrow, we have another beautiful story about love conquering impossible odds. Thank you for being part of our Dear Love Diaries family, where every heart has a story worth telling. Reed Hastings had arranged a blind date for his brother, never imagining it would lead him back to the woman who'd always held his heart. Simone. Montclair had agreed to meet a stranger, never dreaming she'd find the man she'd never stopped loving. Together, they proved that some love is worth fighting for, worth waiting for, and worth choosing over and over again, no matter what obstacles stand in the way. Because in the end, the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone perfect. They're about finding someone perfect for you and having the courage to build a life together that honors both your dreams and your struggles, your past and your future, your fears and your faith in what love can create when it's given the chance to bloom.